very first presenter today is Dr. Jess Jennings. And Jess is a local expert specialising in natural resource management. He was Dairy Australia's Natural Resource Management Coordinator in New South Wales for 5 years and is the lead editor of Shaping Change, Australia's first practitioner text on execution for agriculture and natural resource management. Would you please welcome Dr. Jess Jennings.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to thank the organisers for inviting me as a speaker, and particularly congratulate the Bathurst Whole Food Co-operative for getting this grant and project up and running, and recognise the sponsors and the grant source, which I believe is the New South Wales State Government, and I'll be mentioning them in my talk during the next few minutes. So I'm basically looking to deliver, I guess, what are the likely impacts or the predicted impacts of a changing climate to the Central West and down to a local level, so that it's meaningful to individual farmers and farm managers. So everybody's on the spectrum of climate and climate change, and I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's quite irony, but the announcement this morning that President Trump is pulling America out of the Paris Climate Agreement is interesting that that's the same day that I'm making this presentation saying what are the impacts of climate on our local area. This is known as the spectrum of 6 Americas. If you're on that end of the spectrum, you're alarmed about climate change, to concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful and dismissive. Now I think I know where Donald is on this one, up here somewhere, and the vast majority, around about 70-80%, are up around the concerned or very concerned. But my talk today is not about arguing the science of climate change, whether it's a fact or not. I'd be more than happy to discuss that with anybody if they're interested, but I'm really here to talk about what are the likely expected impacts. So usually talking about climate change gets broken down into 2 broad sub-themes: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is all about how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how to stop human impact. For example, in 2013, in case anyone needs any reminding, humans contributed 3 trillion cubic metres of gas were burnt in the 1 year, 3 billion barrels of oil each month, not for the whole year, but each month, and 300 tonnes of coal per second during the year of 2013. So that's just the fossil fuel component. That doesn't include, methane from agriculture, other sectors, etc. So, and doesn't include what the natural environment contributes as well. I'm not sure if people who deny climate or who aren't interested in it really can, I don't know how anyone can look at those figures and go, well, that wouldn't have an impact, there's no way that would have a bearing. But that's a discussion for another day. So what I'm really here to talk about is adaptation. How will you actually adapt to what the changes in climate are to be? So people have probably heard very broadly that we're looking at around about a 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, and probably 2+ over the next century. But so what? Has that changed your life today? Probably not overly. Here's an interesting graph I came across not long ago, and this is put together by the insurance industry. Basically you've got percentage on the side, percentage increase, and it's starting at 100%, and it goes from 1980 to 2014. So the red line at the bottom is geophysical events that created a loss, that amounted to a loss event for the insurance industry over that time. So it's more or less static, it's gone up a little bit, it's nearly 150%, and it's bobbed up and down. The other 3 lines, there's a blue line which is hydrological events, such as flood, and then there's a green line which is meteorological events, including tropical storms, extratropical storms, convective storms and local storms. So that's the green line in the middle, and it's also doubled up with the yellow line which is climatological events, extreme temperature, drought and forest fire. So that's gone from the starting point at 100% to up around over 300% increase in that period of time, which isn't that long. And the blue line of hydrological events has gone up to nearly 450%. So to say it's not having an impact, you might not see it, clear cut, but obviously that's going to feed into insurance premiums in a big way. Next one. So the broad predictions for Southeast Australia, in a broad sense, Murray-Darling Basin sort of area, longer, hotter and drier summers, warmer winters, more variable rainfall and more droughts. And it's worth noting, I think, that last summer saw 205 weather records broken, just that last summer, of which most of those occurred in Queensland and New South Wales. Now I've got a couple of examples just of more localised impacts of climate on farming. The first one is, just go to the next slide. Okay. So this is just going to an article in the South Coast. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I've just got a screenshot of it, but it's an article from the South Coast Register in February this year. Does everybody remember a bit of a heat wave that we had for 2 or 3 weeks? 40 cows died in one afternoon with that temperature spike. And the reason why these dairy cows died is because they suffer from minimal resistance to the temperature humidity index. So it's called THI. If it gets to over 82, cows start keeling over, particularly high production cows like this. I don't think it affects beef cattle as much. For dairy cows, which are very highly developed genetic machines essentially, once it gets over 80 odd %, their body can't process food and moisture, water, etc., and they just start dying. One farm had about 5% of their herd die one afternoon, which, if you think about it from production terms and the impact of running a business, it's pretty serious. The other thing is that the experts who looked at this said it was totally unprecedented. They've never seen anything like it before. And the concern is, well, realistically, how many more times is this going to happen in future? Next one. So another story not too long back, that was dated 9th of March this year. Headline says it all: climate change to blame for flatlining wheat yield gains, according to the CSIRO. And that is even including last year's record bumper crop. So when you look at the trend, the temperature is still contributing to an overall decline in our wheat yield. Next one. And this is just an article of interest from the Guardian. Extreme weather is hurting Australian farmers. If anyone wants to look it up, there's examples in there that are of interest as well. Next one. But again, what does that mean it looks like for you locally? And particularly not just locally over an average for a year, because saying that the temperature is going to increase by 1.5 degrees or 2 doesn't really amount to much. It doesn't in my mind. I don't think, oh well, that sounds bad. What does 1.5 degrees mean? What does it look like? So to break it up seasonally over the course of the year, this gives you an idea of, this is a graph that I had put together with the CSIRO probably about 2007 or 8. And it was my contracted job at the time, when the peak of the climate change debate was probably at its worst, to go out and explain climate change to farmers around the Forbes Dubbo region and other parts down the South Coast. And this graph, I think, is particularly instructive, and it's a good one to try and capture in your mind to get a picture of, well, what does an increasing temperature mean for us on a monthly basis across the whole year? So basically the bottom yellow line is saying what the average of the temperatures were between 1971 and 2000. So that's a climatic average. And bear in mind that when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about 30-year averages. We're not talking about the weather. The weather is what's happening out there right now. Anything about climate is talking about 30 years worth of weather, all averaged out. So the bottom line is the average from 1970 to 2000, and then the lines above that are what the predictions are under different emissions scenarios. And since then we've been tracking on the highest emission scenario, which of course leads to the increased, highest amount of warming. So essentially that temperature curve is simply shifted up. So winters get warmer, so does autumn and spring, but summer also particularly gets hotter. And so that red arrow at the top there shows how January itself will increase in temperature, so more extreme temperature peaks and more of them. And this part here, I think, is to me the most critical thing in the whole so climate implications, because basically it shows that the current January temperatures are going to start in early December and run through till March, or very late February at the earliest. So your current January conditions are likely to start a month early and end a month later. So 3 months worth of January conditions. What the implications are of that for your average farm, I think, are pretty sobering. So in that summary, which I've basically, that graph just described, is the way that the temperatures are going to change, and an upshot essentially that there is some upsides. There is more CO2 available for plants to use to grow, but there's a limit to how much they can take of that. You will have warmer winters, so you have a capacity to increase that growing season further into winter and pick it up earlier out of winter. But they are pretty minor positives compared to the downside of this, which is essentially more extreme maximum temperatures, both the frequency and the temperature, and the major net effect, I think, for your average farm, sheep, beef or cropping, is a loss in net soil moisture. How is the soil going to compensate of 3 months worth of January temperatures to actually maintain a level of soil moisture? It's not the sort of thing that just having an extra dam on your property is going to solve. Next. So that's not a bad summary for sort of a general picture of getting closer into New South Wales. That previous graph was for Cowra a few years ago, but now there is a much better way of finding out what climate impacts mean for you within a 2 kilometre square area on the map of New South Wales, for finding out what's happening on in your backyard. So this is a New South Wales Government website, Office of Environment and Heritage. It's been up for over a year now. Oddly enough, it hasn't been promoted a great deal, or I certainly haven't seen it ever put into any kind of media or anything like that. Now, if we can, what you do is basically, so if you search on Adapt New South Wales, I'm pretty sure you'll get it straight up. What it will show you then is on this right hand side, you can check how you want to look at it. So if, I'll just drive this for a sec. Okay. So across here you can do it by temperatures, rainfall, I think that's fire, and this one is heat. So show me the changes in heat. So I think the best way to imagine climate change impacts is, I think the most indicative method is in the number of days over 35 degrees. So what are they now? What are they expected to change to? So that's what that one is in heat. And we'll do the state view for, there's 2 time periods. The period in the short term from 2020 to 2039 and 2060 to 2079. So short term and long term. Have a look at the longer term impacts for the whole state. So that gives you a pretty clear idea that the further west you go, the more days over 35 degrees you're going to be getting. Hotter and drier. So you can now, from that graph, at the top of that, there's this thing here called grid view, or you can put your postcode in. Let's just see if it comes up. Sometimes it's a little bit finicky, this website. The amount of data and work that's gone into this must be extraordinary. The best version of this before this was a CSIRO web page, and honestly you need a PhD just to even access one line of data. So this has actually made it so much more accessible. Now you can highlight, I don't know if you can see from back there, but there's a grid going across that whole map, and you can put the cursor on the grid that represents where your farm is, and it will then come up. If you could just click one, and it should, so it says select a grid square. There you go, the change in number of days a year in the maximum temperature being greater than 35 degrees, an additional 33 days per year in the longer term. So you can, and it does actually vary from square to square, so that's obviously modelling that reflects the topography and that sort of stuff. So it's a pretty impressive website, and it's one that I think will give farmers the opportunity to relate personally to what climate impacts are likely to be for them. And I highly recommend have a look at it. Okay, we'll go back to the presentation. So that's the full website, climatechange.environment.newsouthwales.gov.au, but just go for Adapt New South Wales and you'll find it. Okay, so these are the data that I've pulled out for orange. The only thing I've added to this is looked up the weather zone data for what are the current average temperatures over 35 degrees for orange. So the number of hot days over 35 degrees for orange per year on average at the moment is only 1.5. But in the near term, it's expected to increase by 3.2 days, or a total of 4.7 days, which is basically over 300% increase. Now, and in the longer term, over 800% increase. Now that doesn't sound too bad in terms of the aggregate figures, going from 1.5 to 4 through to 12. It's not extreme, perhaps, but when you're a plant or an animal, a sheep or a cow, a soil microbe, sitting out in that paddock, experiencing every single degree and percentage of increase of heat, I think you start to realise that the implications are quite significant. I've also put in there a reference to Dubbo. So while the percentage terms are extreme, 300% increase and an 800% increase, that's something to be concerned about. In Dubbo, for example, the increase is only 136% in the short term and 200% in the longer term. But the fact is they're coming off a much, much higher base. They've already got nearly a month worth of days over 35 degrees in their average summer, and that's expected to double to be nearly 60 days a year over 35 degrees. Now, I wouldn't fancy that if I was a farmer, I've got to say. So that's what you can look at. Very briefly, because I think my time's up, and other speakers will probably talk about this much more, what are the sorts of things that you can look at doing to adapt to these sort of changes? Obviously, the pasture mix and the way you manage your farm can change to map basically with hotter conditions, hotter summers. You might want to cut silage and hay earlier to better match that changing pasture growth curve, which may feed through to the way you feed your stock, etc. And essentially, a massive one, of course, is greater efficiency with water management. But as I said, it's a pretty tough scenario. And one more. You might, for cattle, for example, adjust mating and reproductive strategies to take into account those changes in the pasture growth curve, and recognise that potentially reduced fertility because of higher temperatures. And while for beef properties that's not as bad as what it is for dairy, a dairy property that doesn't have cows reproducing and having the cows lactating, a massive impact. Things like shade and shelter belts, and yes, those cows down the coast did have shade and shelter to a certain extent, but once that THI got to a certain point, there's nothing that basically can be done. Evaporative cooling for stock could be an option, and selective breeding for better genetics to actually survive those temperatures. If you want more information on this, just about every industry, every research and development corporation in agriculture does have their own climate adaptation and mitigation kind of strategy. They also have not been overly advertised or not that well known, but they do have them. So if you look up ones for grapes or orchards or beef, etc., they will have information there. But I would certainly emphasise the best source of advice is professional agronomic advisory services, whether they be government or private sector. And there's a whole range of tools, etc., out there to look at what's the best way, best practice adaptation and best practice mitigation. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.